Okay, so my name is Ali Tharp with the UU Ministry for Earth, UU Young Adults for Climate Justice, and Commit2Respond. Thank you so much to our observer representatives who just got home last month from Marrakesh, Morocco, where they were attending the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change 22nd Conference of the Parties, which was focused on many things, most primarily with regards to the international agreement called the Paris Agreement on climate change. So thank you to those joining us tonight and everyone watching now. My first question is for those who are less familiar with international climate policy. I'm hoping that one of you would be able to just give a brief overview, particularly what is the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, what is the Paris Agreement, and why is it something that we as Unitarian Universalists are paying so much attention to?
Okay, that's a really good question. And this is Doris Marlin, and I will just answer the last part of your question first, which is why are you paying so much attention to this? And that's, I mean, essentially it's because climate change exacerbates every social justice cause that Unitarians care about. So was I muted?
No, we hear you.
Okay. Okay. So that's a very simple answer to Unitarian, why Unitarians care about it. The framework, I don't have a lot of details on, so others can fill in, but essentially countries came together over 20 years ago and developed a collective approach unifying nations globally to address climate change. And so this framework has been building and growing and dealing more and more with how to come together in a unified global way to address climate change. So I'll pass it on to others who would like to add to that comment and move into Paris. And if there aren't any more specific comments, I'll add.
Hey, Daphne, were you there like at one of the founding meetings? Would you like to talk about that?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, this is Daphne Wysham, and I'm calling in from Portland, Oregon. And I was at the Kyoto climate negotiations in 1997.
Daphne, your sound isn't good. Are others having trouble hearing?
No.
Okay. Sorry about that. I'll try to talk slowly. I was at the Kyoto climate negotiations in 1997. The UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was set up in 1992, and it has been meeting pretty much annually ever since then. It was in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was put into place. As you may recall, the US refused to join the Kyoto Protocol, although Al Gore at the time flew in at the last minute and said, as a condition of participating in the Kyoto Protocol, they wanted to put in place a set of flexible mechanisms that would eventually become what we know as cap and trade and offsets. So it's been pretty much since 1997 up until last year that the US has held off on any sort of commitment whatsoever, although we sort of set the terms of the commitment in 1997. It wasn't until Paris last year that the US finally agreed to a set of commitments that essentially meant that every country would set their own binding targets and nationally determined commitments and bring them to the table and move forward. Now, what was amazing was this actually all got ratified by almost 200 countries this year, right before we all convened in Marrakesh. So we were riding high thinking Hillary Clinton was going to get elected and that everything was moving forward, and everything came to a screeching halt. At least on some level, it came to a screeching halt when we found out that Donald Trump, who thinks that climate change is a Chinese hoax, was elected. Regardless of the fact that Trump was elected, what we witnessed in Marrakesh was a coming together of all the countries around the world, including China, India, all of the leading countries in the developing world as well as in the developed countries, saying we will move forward regardless of what the US does. And this is the first time in my experience that this has ever happened, where essentially instead of waiting for the US to act, the rest of the world has said it's too urgent, we're going to move forward anyway. So I'll leave it at that, and anybody else want to add?
This is Shelby. I guess I would just add that, so the goal of the Paris Agreement is to keep the world kind of at a livable place in terms of climate change. And there's a lot of debate, about exactly when the planet would become totally unlivable or partly unlivable, or what is an acceptable level of damage to people and the planet. But I think to simplify it is to say the goal of the agreement is to keep this planet habitable for most of humankind. And that's why we saw so many countries come together, because we want to survive as a species. And the US has a particular contribution to this goal, and that is primarily fulfilled by the Clean Power Plan right now. And so I think one of the big questions that when you hear about dismantling the Clean Power Plan or dismantling the EPA is, could the US still meet its goals in terms of emission reduction through state strategies or other strategies? And if it doesn't, what does that mean for the livability of the planet, given that we're such a large percentage of global emissions, even with all these other countries, all of the other countries of the world nearly banding together to try to meet this goal of radically reducing emissions. So that's kind of why we care, is because, it's sort of, as many of you, if you're on this call, I know you're passionate about this, but just to kind of connect what has already been said to what is in the news right now in the US.
Great. Thank you all for that. That was very informative. So my next question is, what were some of the main points of advocacy that our UU delegation focused on at COP22? And feel free to answer that within specific stories or context. You don't have to just list them off, but what were some of the main advocacy points that our delegation brought forward?
Well, this is Doris, and I would say that when and where we had the opportunity to stand with Indigenous and frontline communities and speak out in support of the recognition and the emphasis that can and should be placed on what those communities contribute. We were there. Anyway, there were many demonstrations and prayers and drumming sessions and vigils, and in particular there was an effort to there was a prayer circle, very large prayer circle one evening in solidarity with Standing Rock, and so that's among the areas that we participated in as Unitarian.
Hey everyone, this is Tom from Durham. I'll take a stab at that. I was there during the first week, and I sort of feel like things were gearing up during that first week. Many things happened, appear to have happened in the second week that might have gotten started in the first week, but really came to fruition the second week. So unfortunately, I missed out on a lot of those. But, and I think there was a sort of a little bit of a recovery period from finding out the results of the US elections. But I think that a couple of things that, for me, that really stood out and places where I tried to focus were, number one, working and trying to communicate and contact the youth that were there. There was, I think, a really fantastic response among the youth right after on the Wednesday after the elections, indicating that they had created this president's to-do list in anticipation of a Hillary Clinton win, and they had created this beautiful scroll that indicated all these things on their list, and then realizing that that Hillary Clinton was not going to be president, and that Trump had won, they immediately crossed that list, the head of the list off. Wasn't the presidential to-do list, it was now the people's to-do list. And I think that their outpouring of emotion and what they were really expressing was it was really heartening and encouraging from my point of view. And then I guess the second thing, which I think really came to a larger degree in the second week, and you guys that were there the second week know, can express this more than I can, but also trying to connect with other faith communities around the world. And there were several gatherings and meetings that we attended as representatives of the UU, as UUs, that to try to start making those connections more globally. And that makes me think of here in the United States as being more connected with groups like Interfaith Power and Light, and with Green Faith, who were there also as being ways that we could move things forward here in the US.
I would just add, this is Daphne Wysham, that I was there I came in, I arrived on Thursday, but I wasn't actually able to observe until Monday in the green zone, which was the area where all the negotiations were happening. So there was a very lively set of sort of impromptu meetings that were happening in the blue zone, and that was where people could come and go without any sort of restriction. We had daily meetings with the lead climate negotiator for the Obama administration, Jonathan Pershing. And one of the things that I was actually most alarmed to learn during that week was that Jonathan Pershing informed us that Secretary John Kerry had just returned from Antarctica, where he said the Pine Island Glacier, which is one of the biggest glaciers there in Antarctica, was moving very fast, and it was threatening to go into the ocean. And when that happened, that would result in 5 feet of sea level rise. I blogged about this for the Huffington Post. You can find my blog. I think I sent all of the links to Allie, so that should be in one of the links that she sends out. But 5 feet of sea level rise would affect virtually every coastal city, and the small island nations would all go underwater. So at the time, my recollection, and I actually ran into him again in Mexico City at the C40 meeting, and I said, did you say by 2050? He claimed he wasn't willing to say it was by 2050 that we would see 5 feet of sea level rise, although that's what I heard in our meetings with him. But it could be by 2050, it could be by 2100. These numbers are completely off the charts, and that's just from one glacier. So one of the things that having attended many climate negotiations, I found the starkness of Jonathan Pershing's revelations quite alarming. I don't know if he was saying these things because he knew that Trump was about to take office, and this was an opportunity to finally speak candidly before he leaves. I don't know if it's just because John Kerry had just gotten back from Antarctica and therefore he was getting fresh information. But it was deeply troubling to me, and I think it should be deeply troubling to everybody that that's the potential just from this one glacier. That being said, I don't want to just completely end in despair. I do want to say that as I started on this phone call, Portland, the city of Portland has just passed a resolution for no new fossil fuel infrastructure, as well as in support of electric vehicle charging stations all over the city, and energy efficiency retrofits for housing. So cities are really leading the way, and we had a wonderful press conference there that included Salote Soko of the Unitarians that you can watch online on the UN website. And again, that's in the links that Allie will be sending out later, where we talked about how cities all over the world, from Calcutta to cities in Australia and all over the world, are, despite their governments, are moving forward with very ambitious climate strategies. And so in some ways, that's where the real action is. And I'm very hopeful when I think about what cities can do.
Daphne, regarding Jonathan Pershing's comment, there was a conference call a few days after Marrakesh, and it was with many NGOs. I don't know how many people were on this phone call, but it was a well-attended conference call. And I specifically asked him if he could repeat the statement he made about the Pine Island Glacier. And he reconfirmed what he had said in our meeting, which was, at the rate of melt acceleration that we're seeing, it could result in as much as 5 feet of sea level rise by mid-century. So he kind of caveated the 2050 with mid-century, but that is still, as you said, an alarming likelihood.
Daphne, you're muted.
That's good to know. I was beginning to doubt my own notes, so I'm glad to know that you reconfirmed that. And he sort of stepped away from it when I spoke to him in Mexico City. So, but just so that people who are on this call know, the federal government has been preparing for perhaps 2 to 3 feet of sea level rise by the end of the century. So 5 feet by mid-century is a quantum leap. It's really extraordinary. A lot of cities will end up being underwater. Most of Florida will be underwater by then.
Well, most of southern Florida. The Everglades, for example, is pretty much at elevation 6. So yeah, southern Florida. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Doris and Daphne. In light of that piece of data, can we talk a little bit about human rights and how human rights currently fits within the Paris Agreement and what that has looked like in terms of the back and forth of trying to get certain commitments on human rights protections for climate displaced people, for farmers, for future generations, even like natural rights, things like that. I'm quite aware this has been part of what we went into COP22 with a focus on both the UUSC and our full delegation. So would anyone like to take a minute to talk about that, or more than a minute? Just there's quite a bit you could talk about. And one thing I think it would be good to do a little bit more discussion about too is the adaptation and mitigation are policy words in the Paris Agreement. And so a lot of this discussion with regards to how we spend our resources, how we make policy, and how we protect human rights in the process fits within adaptation and mitigation. So if one of you would also be willing to just give a definition of those two words.
Well, I can jump in quickly, and then whoever wants to add. This is Daphne again, and I can't figure out how to show myself. I apologize, but if you can do it for me, Allie, I can't figure it out. But anyway,
you're there. I see you.
Oh, good. Okay. So I guess you've been watching me all this time. Oh goodness. Done anything embarrassing? Adaptation and mitigation. Mitigation essentially means, are the investments that we're investing in going to move us away from fossil fuel based and carbon emitting sources of energy, as well as deforestation and agricultural impacts that result in CO2 being emitted into the atmosphere. Adaptation is how can we help countries that are essentially going underwater or dealing with major droughts or floods or storms. How can we provide the financial resources for these countries to adapt to rising temperatures and more extreme weather conditions? And frankly, we've done a terrible job on both fronts. The United States has, in terms of providing any sort of finance for adaptation and mitigation. What we've done is essentially reconfigured development aid that was already being channeled through various development banks and called it adaptation or mitigation funding. We're supposed to be providing $100 billion a year by 2020. They claimed in Marrakesh that we were going to meet that target, but I haven't been able to assess the actual documentation that proves that that's the case. I don't know if others on this call have been able to do that, but it was clear in our conversations with Jonathan Pershing. He said that we're going to have to rely on the private sector, and that the U.S., that it was going to be a challenge for us to provide the kind of money that we need for adaptation and mitigation, and that our budgets have always been constrained, and under Trump, it will likely get worse. And I would say that's an understatement. So yeah, I'll leave it at that, and if others want to chime in.
This is Doris, and I can comment on the adaptation mitigation comparison. So mitigation, in a simplistic way, is essentially prevention of, preventing the situation from getting worse by slowing down carbon emissions would be a simple example. And adaptation is managing the reality of the here and now. And so communities that are already suffering, they want investment in adaptation, of course. So they want protection and assistance and help and a better quality of life and the ability to live without the threat right now. What was emphasized to us by the U.S. State Department representatives was, yes, they recognize that adaptation is a higher priority, but the leveraging of funds you get from mitigative investment goes so much further. So they were kind of just explaining why it's so hard to focus on adaptation versus mitigation. And, you know, we didn't really like that, but they were just explaining. Done.
Tom or Shelby, would you want to speak to what you know of how human rights provisions are included or lacking in the implementation of the Paris Agreement?
This is Shelby. So I'll be really honest, when you're there, some of what is happening behind the scenes is opaque from where we stand. But the sense I got from asking a lot of different people what is happening is that any discussion involving finance right now it's tied up in bureaucracy. And there's differing opinions about whether or not, and so that has a human rights implication because most of the finance is to help nations with less resources financially to either adapt or reduce their emissions or both. And, you know, some of the people that we heard from said, look, this is pretty clearly just basically a stalling mechanism. There's really no bureaucratic problem here. These folks just don't want to budge among the developing countries, and therefore they're going to stall out every time the conversation comes down to what vulnerable countries need. Other people said, no, it's just this is sort of a year where some countries came unprepared, and therefore, you know, everything's moved much more quickly than we expected, and therefore this is a natural part of the process that there's this kind of momentary, temporary sort of need to work out the process. So I think it's probably closer to, you know, money's going to continue to be a roadblock for this agreement. And then I think some of the conversation was also around how to make sure that when there is money available through things like different funds, to make sure that the projects really are grassroots owned projects that could potentially have multiple benefits for communities where certainly climate change is a pressing problem, but so is access to clean water and other like basic anti-poverty provisions. So I think the ideal future is that this money is available and that that the process to access the money is one that allows grassroots ideas and ownership and leadership to come up. But I would say right now that's not looking great. And it's an open question as to whether there will be any real progress on that. I think that was my interpretation. I mean, I think I would love to hear if anyone else either was in conversations directly or had some other sources of information that maybe give a fuller picture of this.
So, Tom, do you have anything to add to that or respond with? I can unmute you. Here we go.
Great, thank you. Yeah, just along the lines of, just to continue what Shelby was saying, that it seemed in different sessions that I went to and people that I talked with, there was just a big disconnect between the top-down kind of approaches and sort of bottom-up. And I was really impressed by a lot of the different groups that were there, whether they be indigenous people or people speaking on behalf of women, that they want a seat at the table and they want a part of the decision-making process. And it just does not match up with what comes down from, you know, on high. Just one specific example, thinking about the REDD+ program, the protecting the forests and managing the forests. One of the indigenous people from the Amazon was saying, why don't you let us manage the forest? We know how to do it. We've been doing it for generations. And if you really want to give money or to do things for programs, give us the money directly. Don't go through the governments, because the governments are corrupt and none of the money will get down to where it's needed. And just, I think that just having a seat at the table and being part of that decision-making process is really important.
Before I move on with our final question, for those who are wondering what REDD+ is, I'll just give context. It's an acronym for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. And it's a program with the United Nations and the World Bank, the private sector, and nation states, and essentially puts trees and forests as carbon sinks into a commodities market for carbon that fits within national market-based approaches to reducing emissions by, like, putting cap and trade on fossil fuel infrastructure, particularly the global north, was going towards these approaches. And as Daphne referenced, the United States played a major part in the proliferation of market-based solutions within our international climate policies. So it kind of leads to a situation where forest-dwelling indigenous people need to become a part of this global commodities market in order to stake a claim, or, you know, in a way it's trying to prevent deforestation for a market. And they're doing that by creating another market for the carbon itself and the forest itself. So it's a very interesting program, has a lot of good intentions on the surface, and then a lot of implications that well up. So this is kind of a good segue into the final question that I have, which is a bit of a political, philosophical question. Unitarian Universalists, through the Commit2Respond campaign, for the last 2 years, as a whole movement, have committed ourselves to climate justice and to being supportive of these communities, like the indigenous groups that hold the wild places on Earth with over 80% of the remaining biodiversity on the planet, and yet are not represented within the negotiating table. They're represented by the nation states that surround them, and we're part of this, like, legacy and colonization. So you know, there are other many frontline groups within nation states around the world, but I wanted to ask a question that's somewhat inspired by an article by Tom Goldtooth with the Indigenous Environmental Network. And he was speaking to Indigenous representation on this international policy level as being outsider, people who don't really have access to the negotiating table, as was mentioned, or even necessarily to the negotiators at the table. So, and the way it was parsed was you have insiders, you have outsiders that are official negotiators, and then you have insiders who are not official negotiators, but who have more access to the people with the most political capital within these negotiations that we see. So, as a faith movement, we are, by my analysis, I would say, and for the purpose of this question, insiders. We were able, as Daphne mentioned, to have briefings with the U.S. Special Envoy for Climate Change. We know that last year at COP21, the State Department was very enthusiastic and forthcoming about getting support from the faith community as a whole. So as part of that faith community that aligns ourselves with the climate justice movement, what role do we have? What can we do to utilize our proportion of political capital in this situation in order to advocate for human rights, for justice, for equity in ways that are accountable to frontline communities of the climate chaos situation that actually have less political capital than we do in some situations and more at stake?
This is Daphne. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
I'll jump in, and again, if anybody wants to tag on top of me, that's great. Yeah, I've worked with Tom Goldtooth for over a decade, several decades. We were at the first Durban Group for Climate Justice meeting in Durban, South Africa, where we came up with the Durban Principles for Climate Justice. Among them, grave concern about the World Bank's role in pushing carbon markets globally, including the REDD+ approach that you've outlined, Ali. There are two problems with REDD+. One is that indigenous peoples, by and large, do not own the land in any sort of formal way that they inhabit. They don't necessarily even believe in land ownership. They just have inhabited forests, and they don't have property rights the way that we define them. So when a forest is turned into a carbon sink by the World Bank or some other global actor, essentially what that means is all of a sudden Chevron or GM owns that carbon in that forest, and they can therefore tell the indigenous people to leave. Now, this is not some, bizarre fantasy. This is actually happening. It almost happened in Chiapas, Mexico, although there was a lot of resistance to that, and it was pushed back. And it's been well documented by various reporters that have been covering this as it's been unfolding in the global South. The other problem with REDD is that essentially what it allows the global North to do is it creates an enormous loophole whereby instead of having a cap on your global emissions, you can buy your way out of them by buying these offsets. And REDD is perhaps the largest collective carbon offset in the world. When cap and trade was being proposed on Capitol Hill, they were proposing 2 billion tons of carbon offsets per year, which would have meant the US could have done nothing until about 2030 and still considered that it was taking action by essentially buying up the forests of the Amazon and elsewhere and claiming that this was an offset. So your question, I think, is a really important one for us to consider, Ali, especially in light of the fact that the Unitarians have pledged to work in solidarity with indigenous peoples within the US and throughout the Americas. But in particular, I think in light of the Standing Rock issue and the power, the real spiritual power that the Standing Rock Sioux have brought to this struggle, it's really important for us to look to the First Nations and the Native American leaders for leadership. I think they are unique at this moment in history in capturing a message and delivering it with great integrity, which is, this is not about markets. It's not about being bought off. It's about the survival of our planet and the human race, and we're drawing a line in the sand, and it must stop. So how do we work in solidarity with people like that? I think we have to approach it very delicately. We're doing it here in the Pacific Northwest by making sure that Native voices are a key component in all of our testimony. We're making sure that we're trying to build long-term working relationships with Indigenous people. And we're really allowing the frontline communities, as you've suggested, Ali, to take the lead, and we work in solidarity with them. They are the ones, for the most part, who are really showing us how to be global leaders on climate change.
Ali, this is Shelby. I think if your question is about the way we show up for the conference itself, I mean, I think I don't know, it seems obvious to me based on what you asked that the only way to really do that is to use some of our spaces as observers and to try to invite other people who might not be Unitarian Universalists to be part of our delegation, if that kind of is something that can help advance their community's goals. Because I think just having an observer spot, or having as many as we did this year, is a real it's a real privilege. And I was amazed by how much access we got just by virtue of having that badge. It's kind of like once you have that, you can go, not everywhere, but you can go a lot of places. And I just don't see any way without including Indigenous people in our delegation that we can be fully I just don't see how we could be fully representing their leadership if they're not actually part of our, doesn't mean we can't partner with them, but I think the question is, how do we actually represent their goals? I think that we have to have at least one or two people who are members of those communities, as part of our team.
That's a great suggestion, Shelby. Thank you. In light of the time, I'm curious to, I guess, we could have one more person respond. And I'll say just a quick reframing. It's how do we use our political capital in order to be directly accountable and in good way and in solidarity with frontline leaders. So I think that was one very solid example of a way we could leverage our political capital.
Well, this is Doris, and we have developed here locally through UUSJ, here in the National Capital Region. We've developed really good ongoing relationship with two offices in the State Department. Now, of course, there will be changes there, but some people may stay, and I think we should continue to keep that avenue open and continue to hone specific messages and continue bringing those messages, not just general stuff, but really come up with thoughtful, strategic, specific messages and bring that forward and combine with other faiths, other organizations, and continue to use that door that has been opened for us.
Great. And thank you so much to Doris, Daphne, Tom, and Shelby for sharing your insight with us. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this conversation and listened into this conversation. I found it myself to be very insightful and informative for how we move forward from here.